Okay, so we usually think of ancient history and modern data as, two completely separate worlds. But today, we're tackling this massive, honestly fascinating puzzle. We're going to connect thousands of years of deep continental history right to a 21st century sociological study.
So, what exactly does it mean to be an American? It's a question you've probably thought about, right? Especially as the country gets increasingly multicultural. There's this constant simmering debate. Does bringing in all these new cultures somehow erase the old definition of our national identity? Or does it create something entirely different? It's the kind of question that literally dominates news cycles and dinner table conversations alike. How do we define who we are when the we just keeps changing?
To figure that out, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, a continent of diverse origins. Second, the early colonial mosaic. Third, the multiple traditions theory. Fourth, measuring modern Americanism. And finally, the multicultural American creed. Let's get into it. Part 1. A continent of diverse origins. Before the nation. When you actually look at the sheer scale of pre-Columbian history, it is absolutely staggering. We're talking about human populations crossing the Beringia land bridge from Siberia up to 30,000 years ago. Just let that number sink in for a second. 30,000 years. By 10,000 BC, humans weren't just arriving, they were well established, spreading across the entirety of North America. And as the centuries passed, these weren't just scattered tribes merely surviving the elements. No, they were building complex, booming civilizations. By 1000 BCE, you've got permanent, thriving villages in the Pacific Northwest. Fast forward a bit, and we're looking at massive urban centers like Cahokia, peaking in the Midwest around the 12th century, followed by highly intricate political alliances like the Iroquois Confederacy by the 15th century. The timeline is just vast, and it is deeply, deeply layered.
And the contrast between these early cultures was just profound. Up in the Pacific Northwest, indigenous peoples built incredibly affluent, salmon-centric societies. They actually celebrated their massive wealth with these elaborate, highly competitive gift-giving feasts known as potlatches. Basically, they were showing off by giving things away. Meanwhile, way down in the arid, sun-baked Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans were acting as these master engineers. They were constructing incredibly complex stone and adobe cities built directly into the faces of sheer cliffs. Places like Pueblo Bonito contained up to 800 interconnected rooms. These were entirely different, highly advanced ways of living, and they were thriving simultaneously on the exact same continent without ever even crossing paths.
Honestly, this continent was a vibrant, almost chaotic mosaic of distinct societies. You had the Mississippian culture out in the Midwest building a towering 100-foot earthwork called Monk's Mound, sitting right in the middle of a sprawling city that was actually larger than London at the time. Crazy, right? Up in the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy maintained a long-lasting peace through a highly structured, representative political system governed by 50 sachem chiefs. Thousands of miles away, way out in the Pacific, native Hawaiians were navigating the stars to settle their islands by 940 CE, completely cut off from the rest of the world. And over in the Caribbean, the Taino people in Puerto Rico grew into a flourishing society of tens of thousands. So what we really have here is incredible, isolated diversity, deeply rooted right in the soil. Moving right along to part 2, the early colonial mosaic, a collision of cultures. Now, it's really important to remember that the European colonial era wasn't exactly some neat, unified effort where everyone just agreed on the rules. Not at all. It was a chaotic, incredibly messy map of competing global powers all trying to grab a piece of the pie. You've got the Spanish planting flags in Florida, New Mexico, and Texas. The Dutch carved out their own super lucrative trading hub in New Netherland. The French claimed vast, freezing swaths of land they creatively called New France. And the British, well, they were just busy trying to survive the brutal winters in Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620. Suddenly, all of these completely different languages, bizarre legal systems, and clashing European traditions were dropped right on top of the hundreds of complex indigenous cultures that were already here. It was basically a cultural free-for-all. So if we're looking for the true root of American identity, the absolute crucial takeaway here is this. Profound diversity and colliding, completely contradictory traditions are quite literally the foundational DNA of this geography. Long before the United States ever existed as a neat concept on a piece of parchment, it was already a massively complex web of converging cultures. That's just the reality of it. Which brings us to part 3, the multiple traditions theory, defining identity. And this perfectly tees up the modern day and a truly fascinating sociological study by political scientist Deborah J. Schildkraut. She actually anchors her research on one massive, super compelling question. Does an increasingly multicultural America engender a multicreedal America? Basically, as a land built on dozens of cultures continues to diversify rapidly today, does our national identity just naturally fracture into a million different belief systems or creeds? It's a real mystery sitting right at the heart of our modern politics.
To test this, her study uses what's known as the multiple traditions theory. Simply put, this is the academic idea that being American isn't defined by just one simple golden rule. Instead, it's defined by a broad, complex, and sometimes totally contradictory range of norms. Take this, for example, fiercely valuing your absolute individual freedom while simultaneously demanding that new immigrants seamlessly assimilate into the broader community. It's complicated, you know? It doesn't always make logical sense, but that is the exact framework we're going to use to measure modern public opinion.
Let's dig into the numbers in Part 4, Measuring Modern Americanism, Empirical Findings. What's truly amazing about Schildkraut's findings is how perfectly they mirror that chaotic, deep history we just explored. She writes, quote, "A complex and contradictory set of norms exist, and it is difficult to reduce them into a single measure of Americanism," end quote. The empirical data actually confirms the multiple traditions theory. Just as our ancient history was a wildly diverse mosaic of completely different peoples and systems, our modern identity is undeniably complex. There is no single, easy checkbox for what makes someone American, mostly because the land itself never had just one standard to begin with. Now, you might logically assume that because modern citizens come from such incredibly diverse ethnic and immigrant backgrounds, they'd hold completely fractured, divided views of what Americanism even means. You know, you'd think a crowded room would have 100 different definitions. But the empirical reality? It's actually the exact opposite. The comprehensive survey results show that a vast majority of people actually share the exact same complex view. They might come from completely different starting points, but they arrive at the exact same destination. The data is remarkably clear here, and honestly, quite surprising. Regardless of your ethnic background or whether your family arrived yesterday or, say, 400 years ago, there is a strong, shared consensus. Bringing diverse backgrounds together doesn't actually fracture the definition of American identity. Instead, Americans of all stripes actually converge on a shared multi-creedal consensus. They all agree that being American is, by its very definition, multifaceted. They embrace the contradictions. Which leads us to our final section, Part 5. The Multicultural American Creed, a tapestry of norms. I want you to think of American identity as this massive, ongoing tapestry. On one side of the conceptual loom, you have our historical mosaic, millennia of deeply diverse indigenous civilizations, followed closely by a chaotic collision of colonial powers from all across the globe. Then, on the other side, woven directly from those exact threads, you have our modern creed. This is a shared national identity that is entirely comfortable holding contradictory norms and multiple traditions all at once. The modern multi-creedal identity isn't new at all. It perfectly mirrors the historical collision of cultures that built the very geography we stand on today. And that is absolutely our key takeaway for this explainer. A multi-creedal America is not some modern departure from a simple, unified past. Why? Because there was no single, uniform past. The complexity of modern American identity isn't a new phenomenon at all. It is the direct continuation of a millennia-old cultural tapestry. Navigating diversity and balancing multiple traditions is quite literally the oldest tradition this continent has. It's the defining feature, you know, not a bug. So, as we wrap up, I'll leave you with this to ponder. If our history is this vast mosaic, and our modern identity is a complex, shared tapestry of norms, which unique piece of the American creed do you reflect? How does your own background weave into this incredible, ongoing story? Thanks so much for exploring this with me. Keep learning, and I'll see you on the next explainer.